I'm Lily Foster, Manager of Public Programs and Public Engagement at the Whitney, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, New Ways to See Digital Art Criticism Now. Tonight's conversation, organized in collaboration with the Carl and Marilyn Thoma Art Foundation, considers the complexities and varied methods of writing about digital art. The program marks the Thoma Foundation's 2016 Arts Writing Award in Digital Art, a merit-based award that recognizes the achievements of an emerging and an established arts writer who have enriched critical perspectives on digital art practice and evolving technologies in contemporary art. This year's recipients are writer and editor Nora Khan, currently contributing editor at Rhizome, and Christiane, adjunct curator of new media arts at the Whitney and associate professor and associate dean in the School of Media Studies at the New School. Tonight's program brings together both critical and artistic perspectives on digital art. In addition to Christiane and Nora, we are delighted to welcome Cheng and Clement Vala, two artists who have opened up new possibilities in digital art practice and whose works have been the subject of Christiane's and Nora's writings. I will also mention that one of Ian's pieces, the 2013 Baby Feet Icaria, is currently on view in the fifth floor in the exhibition Dreamlands Immersive Cinema and Art, 1905 to 2016. This evening's program will begin with presentations by Christiane and Clement. Nora and Ian will then present, followed by a group discussion moderated by Brian Droitcour, associate editor and online editor at Art in America. The Arts Writing Award in Digital Art was established just last year in 2015. It is one of the first and only awards to focus on scholarship in the field of digital art. It is especially exciting for us at the Whitney to host an event that recognizes and reflects on this vital and still emerging area of art criticism and practice. I'd like to thank Christiane for connecting us with the Thoma Foundation, and to thank Christiane, Nora, Ian, Clement, and Brian for joining us this evening. Our sincere thanks also to Mira Burak, Associate Director of the Thoma Foundation, and Julia Miglitz, Communication and Grants Manager at the Thoma Foundation, for making the process of organizing tonight's program, including its more sophisticated than average digital elements, such a pleasure. Now please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you very much for coming out on such a rainy night, and I also want to thank the Thoma Foundation for making this event possible and the Whitney Museum for hosting it, and particularly the Education Department for making this all possible. Our conversation tonight will address both the art and artists that Nora and I have been writing about and are currently interested in, and the subject of digital arts writing, how we see and would like to see digital art represented. I want to start by briefly talking about the contexts in which my digital arts writing has been published and how the outlets for digital art writing have changed over the years. My book, Digital Art, now out in its third edition and translated into a few languages, is a book that you would find in museum bookstores and that really introduces digital art to a broader public. And it's very different from the edited anthologies I have been working on, which have been published in more of an academic context, which much smaller print run. And when I started out writing on digital art in the mid-90s, there actually was no magazine really covering it. So I, together with a colleague of mine, founded a magazine called Intelligent Agent, which was published first as a newsletter, then as a quarterly magazine, and then as a non-profit print-on-demand publication. That landscape significantly changed, and you find now a lot more writing. And I have published in really various outlets over time, be it from magazines such as Aperture or in Art Pulse writing editorials, or in the MIT Technology Review, where my articles on really established game art appeared next to texts on wireless device chargers, and algorithms that could change the rules of online auctioning. So the landscape of digital arts writing has significantly changed over time, and I think one of the questions we have to address is what is the effect if digital art is being covered less in mainstream publications than on blogs and in Vice's motherboard, for example. One subject I'm really interested in right now is the so-called post-digital condition. I have a lot of problems with that term, but what I'm interested in is the condition of artworks and things that are conceptually and physically shaped by the internet and digital processes and take the vernacular for granted, but manifest in very different forms of objects. So these works find their expression in works that are deeply informed by the technologies, but they cross boundaries between media in their final form, and they really address the process of seeing like and being seen through digital devices. And this sometimes filters down in the New York Times, for example, to something that is characterized by just positivity and the melding of satire and admiration and an emphasis on popularity over exclusivity. I think digital art has actually come full circle, kind of, in its materiality from the 60s onward. The artists who were working on so-called computer art in the 60s were writing their own algorithms, but since that information couldn't be rendered to the screen, it would be stored on punch tape, then drawn out with pen plotters and other machines until it found its final output as a digital drawing. Artists such as Vladimir Bonacic created sculptures, in this case, a pixelated sculpture driven by a computer that is very post-digital in its pixelated form. And today you would have artists such as R.D. Vierkant creating his image objects, which take the form of UV prints on dye bond, but they're constantly being altered based on the documentation that the work receives on Instagram photos, be it by the artist himself or other people. So this really has come full circle. And one thing I'm very interested in is how digital technologies and software have changed the way we see and how they construct representations. And what strikes me as important here are the biases that are created by software or by the humans who are writing that software and how we coexist with these technologies. So digital technologies have literally changed the way we see and experience art mediated by digital devices. Software such as 1-to-3D Catch allows us to instantly construct three-dimensional representations of objects in a process called photogrammetry. Software such as Microsoft's Coco, Common Objects in Context, engage with image cognition, identifying, detecting, and classifying objects or features in digital images. The Lifelight software developed at Carnegie Mellon curates short video clips by dividing videos into short 50-frame segments, then constructing a dictionary of patterns, and then applying that forward through the video and assembling what is not similar. So the final edited product is basically based on non-similar sequences. Software such as IM is trained to make aesthetic judgments on what makes a photo great, and you can see aesthetics that score high in the eyes of software here, so this has an aesthetics score of 93%. The photographer's gallery now puts on panels on machines with taste and automated curating. And this past weekend, a Robot Vision Geek Ender consisting of workshops and discussions addressed artistic possibilities of machine vision. People flooded to the website of Google's Deep Dream software to process images that are hyped as machine dreams, and you see one of the results here. Deep Dream is an artificial neural network, a software using the structure of the brain as a metaphor and constructed out of components that are mimicking neurons and connections between neurons, with I would say, very debatable aesthetic results. The computer vision program finds and enhances patterns in images via its algorithms that make the mind perceive a familiar pattern of something where none actually exists, and creates this kind of dreamlike hallucinogenic appearance in overprocessed images. So art magazines now speculate on whether computers might create the next Mona Lisa. And what I'm interested in is how artists have critically engaged with this territory of seeing through software from various perspectives. In his series 9 Eyes, John Raffman has been following the Google car online to collect found images that are taken by the Google 9-eyed camera. And of course, that camera doesn't discriminate, but produces images that Google sometimes wouldn't want to be published, as such of arrests, for example, and sometimes images of highly poetic results. The artist Memo Acton fed a satellite view of Google's headquarters from Google Earth into the Deep Dream software, creating a portrait of the all-watching eye of Google as seen from the cloud. Artist Benjamin Grosser programmed an artificially intelligent viewing software and sent it to watch movies. So the software uses computer vision algorithms to watch for areas of prominence, patterns, colors, and other aspects for each frame of the movie. And what you're seeing here is how the software watches A Space Odyssey. So some lightweight intelligence software here gives the computer agency and allows it to pick between a face, a building, or something interesting in the background. So the computer decides, the software decides what to look at, how to look at it, and where it goes
I know that
next.
you and Frank were
Ian Cheng, in his Baby Feet projects, and one of them, as Lily mentioned, is up in the Dreamland exhibition upstairs, is less concerned with the project of seeing per se, but uses AI for modeling behaviors. And the visuals here are driven by a conversation between chatbots that are also constructing an evolutionary process of visual influences. At the 2016 Liverpool Biennial, I experienced Ian's Emissary Forks for You, in which a small dog, Sheba, appears as augmented reality on an iPad, and Sheba commanded me to follow her throughout the exhibition at Kane's Brewery, and it became very debatable who was whose pet in the process. Clement Vala's works in particular have looked at digital representation from various perspectives, and what you see here is one of the images from his postcards from Google Earth, which he has collected as ready-made views from Google Earth. And the image you're looking at is not really a glitch, but ultimately the logical consequence of image mapping systems colliding, of photography colliding with the 3D mapping. I also wrote the catalog essay for Clement's exhibition Surface Proxy, which took place at Expo Gallery in Paris. And this project explored the dynamics of digital images and economies of representation. The works presented here are objects literally wrapped in their own representation, and the starting point of these objects were iconic architectural fragments, all of French origin, from the Risty Museum in Providence and the Metropolitan Museum and the Cloisters in New York. Many of these fragments came from the town of Cluny, a center of Roman Catholic power until the French Revolution, when it became a symbol of the old regime. And Cluny's status oscillated between a symbol of repression and an iconic historic monument. So Clement employed these historical relics as a basis for a fairly complex process of remediation. So using 1-to-3D Catch, he produced 3D models of the architectural fragments. These models were then digitally draped with cloth by means of the 3D graphics software Blender. And the surface of the original object was virtually imprinted on the cloth. After that, the cloth depicting the image was printed using an inkjet printer and wrapped around a 3D print of the object's form. So the object is reskinned by its own image in a process that Clement refers to as a kind of analog version of texture mapping. So I think what is beautiful to me here is that these objects are relics in more than one sense. They are surviving traces of both physical architectures and of architectures of mediations. So their scars and deformations are visible both in the original architectural object and in the splintered image that is printed on the textile wrapped around the exhibited form. And in this context, I think it's also notable that the cloisters, as one of the museums from which these objects are remediated, are themselves an architecture of fragments. So they are incorporating segments from 5 European abbeys that were shipped to New York and reconstructed into a new building. In her discussion of Byzantine icons, Marie-Josée Monzin has stated that the icon is nothing other than the economy of the image. Monzin argues that there is an economic relation between an icon as a concept and the natural image representing it. So the icon represents an absent, invisible concept through a visible image evoking it. So by negotiating visibility and invisibility, icons reveal themselves. So the images on these textile wrappers in Clement's work conceal and dispute the presence of their underlying form. They are as fragmentary as the form that gives them their structure. The works in Surface Proxy also have a peculiar relationship to the photographic. The image has to fragment and splinter itself in order to conform to the object it strives to represent. So to me, Surface Proxy captures very complex issues of representation. The image surface functions as both a stand-in and it questions its own authority to represent the object. And I think I'll end it here and let Clement talk about his own work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christiane, and thanks to the Thoma Foundation and the Whitney. So I'm just going to talk about my own work really quickly and focusing on some of the issues that were brought up already, the idea of seeing machines and the idea of how we are relating to images that are produced by software. Christiane already mentioned a little bit about my collection of Google Earth images that look like glitches, but aren't glitches, right? They're the logical outcome of the system. And that interests me because it points back to the system itself, right? It gets us thinking about trying to produce a photographic representation, but complicating it with other data streams, with 3D models. And then also just thinking in my own work about ways to physicalize that work. This is called a project called the Universal Texture, where I used some of the images and printed them out, but in a way mimicking what Google is doing to the photographic surfaces, so bending and distorting them in a weird way, maybe trying to correct Google's distortions in my own display of the work. One of the technologies that I've been really interested in that sort of combines photography with technology is called photogrammetry. So this is from 123D-Catch's website. This teaches you how to do photogrammetry. And it basically, you take a bunch of photos of an object and the software stitches the photos together and creates a 3D representation. So in my show, Surface Survey, I was actually, I decided to use photogrammetry to record objects from the Met's collection, but I was, again, much more interested in the process itself rather than any kind of output, right? The sort of final 3D models interested me less than what the software did kind of behind the scenes. And I wanted to expose that the underlying algorithms, basically. So I focused on these. These are called texture maps. They're visual data generated by the software. So I didn't compose these, right? I didn't cut up these photos or compose these in any way. The software actually takes all the photographs, cuts them up, and stores the photographs in this way. So not only did I not compose these, but typically these aren't really even meant to be seen by humans. Right? These are made by the software to store photographic data and then used by the software to produce a 3D model, a 3D representation. So they're kind of an interesting status as an image that's created by one machine, meant for another machine, and never really meant for humans to look at. But to me, or to humans potentially, they look like flattened, fragmented, and exploded photographs, but they're actually, generated for efficiency and for machines to read. They're not produced to look like anything so much as to encode information. So their formal characteristics are the unintentional result of a highly engineered process. So what I did for this exhibition was to extract all of these behind-the-scenes parts out of the software, and again, to kind of reflect back on the system as a whole. But also, I think, in a way to confront issues of aesthetics and meaning, right? So these images that are kind of devoid of any aesthetic meaning in the way that we would traditionally approach images, but yet we can't help sort of reading back into them, reading some kind of fragmentation or disaster. And so I deliberately invoked a kind of archaeological metaphor for their aesthetic, but also to think back on the kind of history of these representation technologies, which led me to kind of start to research where photogrammetry came from. Software often seems to just pop out of nowhere, and it's great and amazing. And I was really, really surprised to find that photogrammetry was actually invented in 1850, 1 year after photography, by Aimé Losada in Paris. These were developed on mathematical principles that had been around since Dürer, since the invention of perspective and the way space is mapped with perspective. Losada figured out a way to reverse the process and to produce basically topological or topographical maps based on photography. This was the first use of photogrammetry. In 1861, it's the village of Mont-Vallonnat outside of Paris. So from very early on, photography was actually recognized as a data acquisition tool, which I found kind of interesting in my research. This is Albrecht Meydenbauer, who really develops photogrammetry quite a bit. He was tasked to create archives of monuments in Prussia that were about to disappear, fall into ruin, crumble, etc. So he was an architect. He would go and survey and measure these monuments. We get this anecdote from Faroki, actually. Apparently, Meydenbauer fell off of the cathedral where that little arrow is and somehow miraculously survived. But this completely disabled him. He was from then on terrified to get anywhere near a cathedral. So how do you survey these monuments without getting anywhere near them? And he turned to photogrammetry, right? The kind of first instance of remote sensing. And he founded the Royal Prussian Photogrammetry Institute, which between 1885 and 1920 actually recorded about 2,600 objects. So, this technology dates back and got me thinking a little bit more about how photography from its inception is more of a digital technology that's about data acquisition. And so rethinking about the ways that art history maybe has thought about photography a little bit. At the same time that I'm thinking about all this, I'm also thinking about the idea of images not made by human hands, right? And how traditionally we have related to images that maybe came from some other. Typically, these have been divine images. Examples include the Shroud of Turin, or the Veil of Veronica, and there's a category of image known as, and I'm going to butcher this, but a Cairo poeta, which are images that are not made by human hands. Also, and don't Google the Shroud of Turin, because it's just like, you get into all these black holes, but there's also a lot of issues of technology and belief at play here, right? The Shroud of Turin, in order to authenticate or to prove that it's the real Shroud of Turin, has been submitted to all kinds of digital machine tests that somehow prove more than other means that it's real. In particular, people have been using the Shroud of Turin to extract the 3D body of Jesus Christ. And I thought it was interesting to start to think of the Shroud of Turin as a kind of proto or maybe an early example of 3D modeling stored in a 2D image. So I just, kind of combining those two ideas is, and Christiane dealt with some of the other issues at stake in the show, but I was thinking of Meydenbauer having to kind of archive these Prussian monuments and the origins of photogrammetry, and then the Shroud of Turin, and decided to shroud these objects. So these are what the shrouds look like when they're flat. These are the distortions Christiane was talking about, and then this is what they look like when they're wrapped back around the 3D prints of the original sculptures. So I'll just, for time's sake, kind of skip through this really quickly. But I will talk a little bit, this is just an example of how they're made, because maybe it gets a little bit complicated and technical. This is a series I'm working on right now in the studio with a tire, but it shows you how I'm simulating the shroud, wrapping the object, and then projecting the object back onto the shroud itself. Which again, thinking of historical precedents, got me thinking about the means that we've developed over time to represent three-dimensional objects on two-dimensional surfaces, right? So looking at the histories of drawing, the histories of map making, and also thinking about the ways that today we're actually building in these existing technologies into our mechanical, chemical, electrical devices, right? There's real analogs between the history of drawing and the history of all these devices that we're thinking about. And so I've been thinking a lot about how these intersect, and this is my kind of diagram for what was going on with the surface proxy show, or that tire that I just showed you, a sort of mishmash of all these different technologies that I decided to call Parallel Lines on a Freeform Surface, which was the title of my latest show at the Providence College Galleries. So for this show, I was really trying to attempt to use photographic means, but to produce pictures that were non-perspectival, right? That didn't use perspective. So they're a kind of new hybrid that borrows from these other pictorial logics that the diagrams kind of explored of mapping and drawing. But there are other ways in which I sort of started to think of conceptual overlaps between drawing, mapping, and photography. So in mapping and drawing, for example, it's very clear that we're producing models, right? We prioritize certain aspects, we filter out other aspects. It's maybe less clear in photography that that's actually what's going on. Because we've come to privilege the, quote, indexicality of photography, and because it produces trompe-l'oeil perspectives that are in the human color spectrum, we somehow think of them as more real and more direct. But my work with photogrammetry kind of pointed me out to this idea that actually, no, photography is just as much of a kind of model-making device that extracts just a particular, very narrow range of data from the environment and represents that. So I've mostly just been trying to sort out, and it's not fully formed, but this idea of image models, right, rather than just images, and that's sort of recordings produced with particularly calibrated data acquisition technology and rendered in particular instances on screens through projectors and through various types of printing, right? So moving away from the original and the copy and really thinking about the whole chain of protocols and technology. And thinking about how all of these have paradigms and biases built in, and how crucial it is to look at the underlying systems. So to sum up really quickly, I've just been exploring images, or exploring images generated by systems, thinking about authorship, viewership, meaning and interpretation in these images, and thinking about what kinds of paradigms of vision are being built into today's picture producing apparatuses. And just to kind of wheel it back to writing a little bit, I think it's crucial today that arts writing engages the way Christiane's and Nora's does with the underlying systems and processes, and not just out of like a nerdy kind of technical interest, but because these systems actually define the way in which we relate to images, the way we extract meaning or not from them. And so I think it's really hard to talk about aesthetics in a kind of void and to treat the underlying processes as somehow cold or alien, and remembering that they are all part of the meaning or the way in which, yeah, basically we relate to these kinds of images. So that's it.
Hello. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight with Christiane, Ian, Clement, and Brian. And I wanted to start out by expressing my sincere thanks to Carl and Marilyn Thoma and the Thoma Foundation for this occasion and this award and the many months of research and writing which they've made possible. I'm beyond grateful. So when we were workshopping the title for this panel, New Ways to See was the first phrase that came to my mind, in part because Ian Cheng's work really embodies a challenge to see and to practice seeing in new ways within and through systems. When I first encountered his live simulations in still shots like these, I wasn't totally sure of what I was looking at, but this reaction wasn't all that unusual for me because I write about digital art, so I'm usually, in a first encounter, never completely sure of what I'm looking at. But the pleasure of writing for me begins here in discovering and parsing an unfamiliar object or experience and finding language to wrap around it. These images were from Ian's Emissary and the Squat of Gods, and they instantly set us in something like the landing map of an open-world game, a camp filled with eerie and totemic figures surrounded by a primordial landscape. Once I began to watch, or rather experience this piece, I was seized by a whole range of unfamiliar sensations past the thrill of non-recognition. This isn't animation, but a simulation in which Ian has designed and coded rule sets for characters and objects, using behavior as his sculptural material. A handful of basic algorithms drive the movements and are left free to interact and behave as they will. This experimental world is a kind of virtual biome. Ian's chosen premise plays out through genetic algorithms. The premise can be an environment, a character, an animal, an object, and the computer carries out the premise for each being, no matter how outlandish. And most importantly, and I'll return to this world can run on indefinitely with no end state and no final form. So we watch this small girl file across the land, followed by other shaky figures who cross into her path and cut across her body. They all gather at the base of a godlike figure, possibly a shaman or emissary, and they stagger around deep violet and gray hills lit by campfire, flinging their weight about towards some unspecified end. These growing, imperfect beings change, and they change one another. So the dynamism of these characters as they come into their own is really just incredible to watch, and the whole community begins to feel like an organism, its actions emergent and unpredictable and outside of us. A simulation is crucially different from a game, since I'm not actively taking part or playing a role within its bounds, but it does exert an important pressure, namely to become a more active viewer. My natural impulse is to try and narrate this world in real time, but storytelling here seems really ill-fit. For one, I'm not sure how the girl will change or what her intent and purpose is, if any. And these characters defy standard language and description as they morph and split and bleed, and then reconstitute themselves within the span of 10 to 15 seconds. So the sound is off now, but at times they seem to speak in artificial tongues, and they struggle to speak. And there's a real sensation of watching a civilization in the throes of birth, of early man coming to consciousness in a sort of brutal and ecstatic process. Over time, Ian's simulations have evolved in form and content, becoming more challenging and layered and complex. Earlier compositions show detailed objects crashing and splitting across the field, but each new installment shows more narrative lines and goal-oriented behavior. The worlds and the simulations seem to cohere more, but this is an illusion. This is controlled chaos as it flirts with glimpses of order. The evolutions of a whole lifetime of generations come to pass in minutes, and perspective shifts on a dime, and protagonists fade and reemerge. In Someone Thinking of You, we follow a dark, abstract, tumbleweed-like mass as it swoops and slides gently across a rocky pool. The object attracts and repels as it moves, channeling anxieties and denser, more secret thoughts. It's hard not to be both charmed and moved by the detail and unearned intimacy here. Ian has described his practice partly as composing with soft things, like software or behavior or cognition, as these soft and felt elements drive and direct the flesh. I'd also like to suggest that spending time with these fantastic objects trains one to see anew in a few ways. Watching this object, for one, I'm jolted out of the standard God view of a simulation. I have to try and understand this being at its level and within its context. I'm also trying to peer past the surface and guess at the rules organizing it beneath. And even as I feel the compulsion to interpret and name it, I am refused. And so as a result, my relationality with the object and further how it affects me becomes paramount. In Emissary Forks at Perfection, we're carried 30 centuries, into the future after Squat of Gods, unfolding this saga about cognitive evolution from ancient man to artificial intelligence. In this world, the emissary is a Shiba, or multiple Shiba dogs that guide the walker along. At first, all this unscripted change can seem almost monstrous and uncanny, and the dogs seem to run the show, and then the humanoid figure in the mist is disoriented and struggles to carry on. Then the interplay between the emergent, the algorithmic, and the story can become thrilling. We're witnessing complexity that we can't actually describe or hold very well. And we're changed because we're almost intuitively watching develop an emotionally cohesive and coherent way to relate to the uncanny. And it turns out that we're actually quite good at creating meaning in difficult and overwhelming environments. Some more screenshots of this. In this piece, Forks for You, we're brought into the simulation to have a taste of what it might be like to be algorithmically led, as though we don't already feel this every minute of the day. Ian suggested that we are, in a way, already living in legacy simulations of our own design, organized by habits and cultures, laws, and of course, ideologies. So the breaks in our simulation, to tread sort of dangerously on Elon Musk territory, are where we learn and become more powerful. And what I mean by powerful is cognitive flexibility. Through embodying this endless forking to new end states, we can override genetic hardwiring and neurological presets, destroying the map of our own personal world, even as we make it. Ian's work demands not only new seeing, but new languages. To be able to explain this coherently, we become a bit like the simulation, twisting and molding our descriptions to its movement. We have to labor to hear its not yet coined words and concepts, somewhere in the excruciating twist from normative to uncanny, from a symmetrical face to a grotesque. When our own narratives break down, how do we deal with the void that rushes in? One way is to leap right in and to navigate that void, to become more comfortable with the knowledge that there will be no perfect end state. You just get better at managing yourself and your dread within the unknown, at holding your story and inevitable contingencies side by side in your mind and body. The live simulation allows us to relate to the chaos of our own lives. It is a space in which humans can imagine and examine and recalibrate their relationship to radical change. We can potentially learn to be comfortable with no end state, with ambiguity, with the potential that we might and probably will crash and break down. In examining this exchange between simulation and viewer and between computer eye and human eye, one might see how the artificial eye moves indefinitely and without us. We're in thrall to its eye, forced to imagine what that computational seeing means without our watching and our naming. It's to say that perhaps we have to evolve along with these artificial life forms, learning from their glitches and their breaks. And it's also to say being ready for the future is to learn to really see beyond ourselves to the systems that organize us. So, thank you.
Hi, I thought I'd share with you just a few projects. It's gonna sound kind of redundant because Nora presented these projects so beautifully already, but I thought I'd just kind of narrate maybe my process and how in the beginning, when I first started making simulations, or what I came to call simulations, I really didn't know what I was doing. It was around late 2012, early 2013. And I simply had an idea at Whole Foods that I wanted to make a video game that would play itself. And it was a totally meaningless idea, but I was really animated and excited by this idea because before that I was making animations. And in animation, you can really labor over every single millisecond to perfection. And the end result is something very static in the end. You can watch it beginning, middle, end, and you can know every single second of it. And I, as an author, as an artist, really wanted to surprise myself. And so I'll show you the very first simulation I made, which was in 2013. It's called Entropy Wrangler. So again, like I didn't know what I was doing, so my only idea was that I would fill this kind of video game space with objects that I was interested in that were very legible. So you get a dolphin here, you have a kind of a moon, a person, things that you or I, looking at this representation, would understand immediately. But what I was intrigued by is if I gave each of these objects certain properties and behaviors, even as limited as they were, in reaction to each other, they would start to kind of collide, deform each other, sometimes stick to each other and form little kind of sculptural assemblages that at the time when I first made it, when I first pressed play and all the code was working, like I couldn't anticipate the endless results or the seemingly endless results that came of this. But over time, as I watched this, and I had to watch this many, many times, it felt ultimately kind of meaningless. It felt kind of like the way the Big Bang feels when we imagine the Big Bang, which is a kind of a set condition of matter that you just let go. And I struggle still as an artist with this idea that art has the burden of being meaningful. And I feel that pressure sometimes. And in the next project, or several simulations later, I made a kind of breakthrough for myself, which was this work called Something Thinking of You, which was a lot less chaotic. It's very, if you can hear the sound, it's much more peaceful, and it's a simulation focused much less on a kind of random composition of objects, and much more on the agency of one character or one imagined organism. And it was really pleasurable to imagine the life cycle of this organism, program that life cycle, but leave many of the conditions that will allow it to live up to chance and up to the environment that it's in and up to the decisions that it makes at any given moment. Not to be too technical, but there's an extremely basic, like, I hesitate to call it a neural net, but it's kind of modeled off a neural net, where it's taking the inputs of the moisture and the simulated moisture in its environment, the time of day, its own hunger, its own thirst, its own sense of threat, and even the position of the camera. Interpreting that, all those data points in a kind of stochastic way, and then outputting, sometimes stupidly and sometimes intelligently, into one of its handful of abilities that I designed myself. But over time, what emerges is very interesting sequences of behavior and what seems to be a kind of intent. I mean, I would never claim that this is a conscious being, but I did come to see it as a kind of pet. And I can watch this for hours, and I can discover new behaviors and new kind of strategies in which it pursues its goals in the environment. Sometimes it ends up looking like a kind of predatory octopus, sometimes it looks like a sea anemone, sometimes it looks like a plant, sometimes it tries to mimic the rock, sometimes it sheds all its tendrils and kind of looks like a wet napkin. For me, this was a real breakthrough because it allowed me to instead focus on how one models behavior at the kind of brain level, how you could define intelligence in a way as making do with the body that you have, but sequencing and deciding what to do with that body at any given moment. And this led me to the work that Nora was showing, called Emissary and the Squad of Gods, which I'll show you here briefly. So what's happening here is there's a simulated community on the side of a volcano, and they're facing a threat. And a threat's a very funny thing because a threat's not something you know what to do with. Like, if there was a fire in this room, we'd all run, but if there was the smell of smoke, we'd have to kind of hedge our bets and decide whether to like endure this lecture or to run out and save ourselves. And this is the kind of threat that this community faces. It's precisely a moment where you're unsure what to do, and this is extremely stressful. Threats are way more stressful than actual disasters. And so they experience tremors in this environment, and it's uncertain whether they should uproot their entire community and leave the volcano, or kind of wait it out and see and call the bluff of the tremor. And what individually each of the different characters have is an extremely basic mind, or AI, in which they have a set of needs that deplete. So they have a kind of a need for hunger, a need for thirst, a need to be social, a need to clean up the environment, a need to play. And those needs are constantly depleting at different rates. And in the environment, every object in the environment, including other people, have virtual advertisements on them that advertise a fulfillment of that need. So for example, a pot of water might advertise to a thirsty agent, drink me if you're thirsty, and that will entice them to go to that object. But when you sequence and you lay out many objects, the decisions and the sequences of decisions that come about become incredibly complex, and you start to see value judgments. Do you go for the half-full bottle that's close to you versus the full bottle that's 10 meters farther away? And each of the agents has a family structure, so they're all related to each other in different ways. So if their mom went to the far bottle, they would bias themselves socially to go for that too, even if the closer thing is easier. And all these agents are extremely reactive, meaning that they're responding to conditions that are in the moment and can be interrupted at any time and kind of distracted. Meanwhile, there's one character, this emissary character in the red, and she has a very different mind. Literally and technically, she has a different mind in that she has a set of narrative goals, and those goals are extremely fixed, and she's very dogged at following them. But because she's in this reactive simulation, she can be distracted from those goals, she can procrastinate those goals, she can be recruited into the other agents' activities, and likewise, one of her goals is to organize some of these other people, which anyone doing any organizing knows is extremely difficult, and she faces those difficulties too. And so this kind of came full circle for me about addressing this question of how art can be meaningful, or if it even needs to be meaningful. So on one hand, I found that the opposite of a meaningless simulation is like a fictional narrative, something that gives you perspective and lets you feel your way through a problem. And you could say in a sense that the emissary has a story, and I've coded and programmed that story, but because she's in such a reactive environment on the plate of the simulation, her sense of meaning and our sense of meaning watching her story is constantly interrupted. And it led me to realize that maybe art's burden is not to be meaningful, but to really explore the relationship between, oh, you want to see the bird? Is to explore the relationship between meaning and meaninglessness. Like, on the one hand, we need meaning to make sense of like whatever we're watching here, right? Like, I need to kind of narrate it. But on the other hand, like, when life becomes too meaningful, it kind of becomes a habit, and you need meaninglessness, like a random accident or random threat, to kind of shake up your mental models of what is actually worth pursuing in life. And I feel that as I continue to make these simulations, I'm really trying to pursue this sort of dialectic between meaning and meaninglessness, which, to tie this to a little bit to arts journalism and arts writing, I made a diagram while procrastinating, not making my work, about the inner psychology of what it feels like to make art, and I think really captures this dichotomy between meaning and meaninglessness. Maybe I'll make this bigger. I mean, just to narrate myself in it. So like, when I had the idea to make a video game that plays itself, I would call that, or maybe I should back up. So the horizontal axis is your inner psychology as an artist, and that's sort of to do with your level of fear, whether you're trying to seek normalcy and like trying to make something that you already know and refine it, or you're trying to like say, like, fuck it and try to do something that's outside your boundaries of comfort, that maybe you don't know so much about, that maybe the world doesn't know so much about. On the vertical axis is the artist's kind of sense of the viewer's psychology, which I think is a sort of measure of one's interest and curiosity and thoughtfulness about human nature. Art, the idea of art for machines is an interesting question because I think so much of art is about your relationship with what the viewer's thinking and what the norms of the culture you're in are thinking. And so we can plot these 4 kind of kingdoms of art. And me trying to think in Whole Foods about a video game that plays itself, I felt started in this sort of new art, this kind of bottom right quadrant. And this is a funny place because on one hand, it's extremely experimental. It's where like the coolest shit happens. It's very iconoclastic. It's kind of punk. But on the other hand, it's totally meaningless. It's sort of like technology for the sake of using technology. And my mom would have no kind of metric or understanding of what that even means because it's fundamentally meaningless in her eyes. And as an artist, I mean, I would have to, in a way, create some perspective, some emotional coherence around a video game that plays itself. So maybe I start to call it a simulation. And maybe we can start to explore properties of a simulation, which are that it can express constant change, it can express emergent evolution. And I tell this to my mom, and she thinks, oh, wow, my mind is blown. Thank you, Ian. You never blow my mind, because they're graphic designers, and she just tells me, like, I need more yellow and orange in my work. And, like, for one time, like, my mom, like, really got it when she saw Emissary and the Squad of God. She says, like, Ian, I'm very proud of you. And I thought, great, I conscious changed her. I mean, at least my mom. And then I think if I reiterate this, if I say simulation, 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 if I think in the eyes of those who write about art, I mean, this is a big if they choose to like adopt that language and see the potential of how a word can contain a multitude of meanings that are more complex and more nuanced than other words, like I wouldn't want to call my work a video game that plays itself. I certainly wouldn't want to call it video, which is frequently mistaken for. If I reiterate enough, then it becomes its own kind of orthodoxy. It could become this meaningful, stable cosmology we call good art, which is its own poison in a way. It's its own utopia, which is it can become extremely stale. But it represents a kind of concentration of a kind of art where it's unquestionably good. It's unquestionably meaningful for our culture. And then, if we took the next step and like we started making like mugs of the simulations and like things like, I don't know, like if I started making I don't know, like kind of bastardized versions of the simulations for like a Tamagotchi watch or something. Maybe I would fall into flag art and I could sell on Etsy, And there's a kind of economy in that world too, and it's a place for remembering things, and it's a place for storing very quick kind of symbols in our culture, but it's also a very flat place. And when I think about the dichotomy between meaningfulness and meaninglessness, I often find that when discussing new media and when discussing digital art and when discussing works that utilize new technologies, especially for the artists like myself, we're often stuck trying to justify its meaningfulness when we need to like narrate it first and then reiterate it. And so there's a journey to get there, and as an artist, the process is really about really journeying through all these quadrants. I found personally, and then the result is simply what happens when you run out of time, money, options, and energy, and you just kind of land on one. I can't say I'm in full control of what I'm doing, and that's always been true. And I've made all forms of these kinds of art, I think. And with that, I'd like to end on that. Thanks.
Well, thank you for these thought-provoking presentations. I'm going to ask a few questions to generate conversation among the panelists, and then we'll open up questions to the audience. So, Ian and Clement, you both make work that's about machine perception, but Clement, you're sort of looking at the ways that technologies of projection interact within a world of images, whereas Ian, you're making these simulations where artificial intelligences are modeling behaviors that reflect some kind of meaning back onto the world we know from nature and society. So I'm just wondering, when you look at each other's work, are there certain things you see that, moments of similarity or points of possible conflict or anything else?
I mean, I love the making of tire video, where you simulated this cloth on the thing, and that's seems to be an essential part of getting the final composite image. It's super beautiful.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm actually a huge fan of Ian's work, and I think no, but to answer your question more directly, I guess like one thing that really strikes me, and I don't really know the terms to use it, but might be the idea of like otherness. And I think that like the tire video, when I make them, those things are they're kind of funny because I'm like digitally throwing this piece of fabric at this process that I more or less control, that's been sort of defined by all these engineers, and it really feels like a foreign process. And in Surface Survey, I was actually literally pulling out images that sort of machines were composing and trying to read an aesthetic into them. And so in terms of my own work, there's like a weird distance from it, or like you said, like trying to surprise yourself from the outcome of a particular process. And so it's really nice to see that in your work. Like I can imagine that watching these simulations for hours and really learning what's in there, what you've put in there but haven't really put in there, there's that strange relationship. So I would say that's one of the things that I see really sort of in the work and really intrigues me.
Okay, so to move the conversation toward writing, it seems that artists who are working with digital media are often asked to speak for themselves, to either through interviews or through writing about their own work. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this, but one of them could be, the lack of a robust corpus of digital art criticism, and the struggle of critics finding ways to write about it themselves. So, Clement, I was sort of interested in your catalog for the Expo show, where you collected a group of citations from historical reference books as well as conversations between you and other artists, and sort of assembled them into this collage that talks about the history of photogrammetry and projection technologies. So I was wondering, do you think of that as a kind of writing project, a form of conceptual writing or something like that, or?
I guess, I mean, writing is so hard. Like writing is really tough for me. I think especially for an artist writing about your own work. I mean, maybe Ian, you can chime in too, but there's like so many different overlapping ideas and so many intentions, and some of them might come through, some of them might not come through. Some of them you hold very dear and nobody else sees them. So that felt just like a way to provide a kind of inventory of the things that I had encountered or that I was thinking about during the process of making the show, without having to. It's always really weird about having to like be the own art historian or do the own theoretics of your work, because it's kind of too close and too dear, and I always tend to find that the wrong idea gets emphasized, or like my version of a particular idea, and it's true that once the work gets out there, I mean, that's a lot of what my work is about, is okay, how meaning is read into things without necessarily understanding the intent that went into that meaning, whether it's engineers or artists. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it was a form of conceptual writing, but it wasn't meant to function like an essay or arrive at any kind of conclusion. It was more of like a kaleidoscope of interests and citations and just things I'd been looking at.
But then you could also think of your work as also sort of presenting histories of, imaging technologies too, and so, yeah, the text sort of does a similar function. Ian, so you've sort of like given descriptions of your own works for moves in art form, and I think it was in Freeze you kind of wrote about this account of seeing Jurassic Park as a kid and how the projector caught on fire while you were watching it, in this sort of. So I'm kind of curious about like the kinds of prompts or requests you get from magazines and how you go about approaching them. Like how do you get started?
Yeah, I mean, the few times where I have been approached by magazine, I saw it as an opportunity, especially around in 2013, 2014, when I first started making simulations to really clarify what it was I was doing, and to try to clarify it on a plane or a level that wasn't to do with the underlying technology itself, but with maybe some of the perspectives or ideas that were kind of emerging as I was making them. And again, like kind of reiterating what I considered a simulation to be, why that word was interesting to me and why it was kind of fraught at the time to say that. And then also, I simply really hate the idea of being called a digital artist. I really hate being a digital artist. I would rather just be an artist or just a person. But I mean, being called writing allowed me to have an escape velocity outside of being a digital artist, because digital art is extremely hard, difficult, and political to talk about. And if I could kind of lend a little voice to what I was doing, I could kind of escape the problems of that particular label and kind of core in at the issues I was interested in. Things that I think are much more basic, like ideas about change, ideas about how humans relate to change, and how, what I was saying before about the relationship between meaning and meaninglessness. I think these are fundamental to all art practices, and the technology is simply incidental to the fact that I'm making art, in 2016.
So beyond the label of digital artist, are there other frustrations you have with the way that your work is written about?
I hate when this is like a complaint session. I'm just going to air my grievances. I hate that they're often mistaken for videos, which is a very fair kind of mistake to make, or a fair kind of misunderstanding. And often it's weird to call it. It's weird to be considered also a digital artist, considering that on the internet itself, where I assume most people look and kind of preview art now, it's very hard for me to represent a simulation online, and this shouldn't be a problem. I'm trying to work on a streaming service to show you what an actual simulation feels like, kind of like the way nature cams feel when you log on to like a pond in Africa, where they show like a wildebeest live, like kind of attacking a group of lions, and it's live and it's riveting, but then there's hours of total boredom.
Now, were you showing live simulations here, or was that video capture?
This is a live simulation here. It's running.
No, was yours too?
Those were screen captures,
Okay.
screen recordings.
Yeah, this was the software from my computer. It's basically it's an app that runs, and but yeah, I just hate when it's mistaken for video, but I can understand why, and I talking about it, even being here is a clarification of that.
Or Nora and Christiane, do you have, are you thinking of any certain like cliches of writing about new media art that you encounter in your reading or that you've struggled with in your own writing? Clement, you can also sound off on this too, because I don't think we got to you yet. But.
Well, absolutely, and I would actually like to second Ian's complaint about the video aspect of it all. So that has been happening to me a lot in works I have shown, actually, and also in audience reception, that people, particularly in a museum landscape, fall back onto thinking this is a video that plays by itself. So one of the challenges has really been, in terms of cliches, to understand and to communicate the nature of real-time generative works and the rules that it employs. And I think that also gets you over this perception that, oh, digital art, it's cold, it's machinic, there is no emotional context for it. Well, I find these pieces deeply emotional, and they really touch me. But that is something that as a writer and as a curator, you really have to learn to communicate, and I think it's very dependent on the context. It will happen, the misunderstanding will happen less at a media arts festival than within a museum such as the Whitney.
I try to be patient, and I think, like Ian, my gauge for success is often how my mom responds to things. And it's taken years and years and years, but in the process of trying to explain my work to her and why I'm interested in certain artists, there's a few things that come up, a few binaries that I try to address every time I write a piece. And the first is this idea of digital dualism, which I think is coined by Nathan Jurgensen, it's a media theorist. And this idea that anything that is digital, anything that is on the screen is somehow less real or less valid or less personal than something work that is tangible, a painting. And this translates to our valuation of skill, and then that also affects our perception of artists and what work goes into the category of high art versus low, what goes into a museum versus a gallery, what stays online. And so I think breaking that down slowly and surely, one, by addressing digital art or screen work in the same terms and with the same language and the same poetry and force that you would use for work that is standing in a museum, is, I just take that for granted. You just surge forward rather than taking time to sort of justify and explain it. And another sort of binary that I run into is this idea of artificial intelligence as being counter to, or like versus or in opposition to human intelligence. And I think Ian really illuminates this hybrid, or this hybridity that we're starting to see, the idea that human intelligence and artificial or machine intelligence run side by side. So those are two binaries I try to work on for my mom.
So Christiane, you brought up the issue of context, and also in your first slides, you were showing the wide variety of places where writing about digital art can appear, whether it's like a tech magazine or an art magazine. And of course, now those boundaries get even more confused because people are often just clicking on links they see on social media without even knowing what kind of publication they're reading. So I'm just wondering how you kind of approach that field, how you sort of choose where to write, what to write. I'm also thinking about how, you're at very different positions as writers. Christiane, you're working more as a curator and academic, and Nora, you're more of a critic and an editor. So how do those institutional biases sort of present, obstacles or, benefits to your writing?
I guess that's a twofold question. So I think my writing or background for writing has changed. When I was writing for Intelligent Agent, I was actually writing arts criticism, reviewing shows, while now, as you say, I'm writing much more from the position of a curator who gets invited to do catalog essays. What I like about it is that I can really write about the art I like. I'm never in a position where I have to trash an exhibition and feel bad about it, because I just wouldn't write about it if I do not like it. Yeah, so I can, on that level, be very selective. But as a curator, I also feel that it's kind of necessary to delineate, because I might want to work with an artist and I don't like one particular piece, and then writing about it and being very critical of it while working with that artist in another show might be problematic. So there are really boundaries that need to be negotiated. As to the first part of your question, I think it's both great and very difficult that digital art gets covered in so many contexts. I think that ultimately it isn't important if art gets classified as art, as long as it speaks to people, as long as it changes their life. So whether they see it as art or not, when they encounter it in a context very different from the museum or arts magazine, ultimately doesn't matter. I still see a kind of imbalance between digital art being covered in major arts outlets for various reasons. And this
Maybe you should pitch more.
That's actually very true, but to be brutally honest here, the reality of my life is that I cannot even take on what I'm being offered. It's like one thing after another, and sometimes every day. So it becomes very reactive, and you're absolutely right. I should say no and be more proactive and pitch to Art Forum instead of writing all the
Or Art in America.
Or Art in America. Yeah.
Nora, do you want to speak to these questions?
Sure. I think, well, for one, I didn't start as an art critic. I didn't even start writing about art. I started in fiction. And as a teacher of writing, I taught poetry and fiction for a number of years. And then started to get restless and started to write and collaborate with artists who wanted fictional pieces for that. They felt that experimental writing, and I believe this really strongly, experimental writing fits experimental fields really well, and you can draw very strongly from the tradition of experimental poetry, because you have this idea of, in literary theory, of being defamiliarized. And when you see an uncanny image or you see something strange that you can't find the language for, that's when you turn to poetry. You turn to new metaphors, you turn to strange images, and that's what really pushes language. And so I've often found, I think I've found the spaces where that writing is encouraged, but I'd love to see more experimental writing in traditional magazines and spaces, but that's a hard sell.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you're talking about how you came from fiction, because we sort of heard you give this very lyrical account of Emissary from the Squad of the Gods from the first person, and that's an approach you've used in writing about Ian's work before, like his Bad Corgi. Mm-hmm. And it makes me sort of think not only of games writing, where reviewers are, describing their encounter with the game and the sort of personal navigation of the game world, but also, writing about performance art in the 70s, where certain critics were just sort of giving these frank first-person accounts of what they saw and what they felt, and how this was kind of very different from the more kind of formalist art criticism. So I was just wondering if you sort of came to this approach through fiction, or if you're looking at other kinds of precedents, or how, what made you decide? I think for a lot of writers, it's kind of scary to, especially art writers, it's kind of scary to jump into the first person and get very personal. So how did you do that?
Sure. A lot of my fiction is in first person. It's not necessarily about me, but it's just the easiest form or way for me to speak about my personal experience with an art piece. And also in games writing, you find it's really common to have a sort of memoir about your experience in games. And the writers that have inspired me, like Jen Frank and Lee Alexander and Carr Ellison, they're really well-known tech writers, but they started as games memoirs. They were trying to explain why simulations and game worlds meant so much to them at a certain trying time in their life. And that translates to art and to fiction and to poetry. Like it's extremely personal for me. And criticism is very personal, because you can only deconstruct what you love very deeply. And in terms of writers who really inspire me, Lynn Tillman definitely comes to mind. She's a fiction writer. She's a poet. She writes, beautiful monographs for artists. And I think you can sort of fluidly move in between. And the more that you can move between worlds, you can try and fit language to difficult art. Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if the rest of you sort of have ideas about, sort of responding to what Nora's saying about how experimental forms fit experimental practices. If you kind of see any, now that we've aired our grievances, what are maybe some positive ways of looking at, how we move forward, what is good in the world, and so on.
I'm really into Westworld right now.
Okay.
It's pretty good. In all seriousness, for me, it's a show that I can talk to my mom about, and she'll tell me about AI issues that she's uncovered in Westworld in a way that the show has, whatever you think of it, it can at least hold those ideas, and they can make them really palpable, and you can feel those ideas through the kind of the narrative that Westworld presents. And what's interesting is seeing the journalism around Westworld, which is kind of a play-by-play, because it's being unrolled by HBO on a weekly basis. And you get this very, similar to what you were saying about Nora, a kind of first-person experiential point of view about the kind of complex of ideas and emotions that you feel in a kind of show that's, has a coefficient of innovation in it, a little bit.
It's interesting. I mean, you're talking about recaps, TV episode recaps, which have become such a widespread form of writing. I mean, I can't even imagine what that would be like in art criticism. It's like someone goes to an exhibition week after week and writes about each painting as a different entry or something.
This is an Art America idea.
Yeah. Maybe we'll try it.
But I just quickly wanted to add to that. I think Ian brings up an important point, which is how certain ideas that you struggle to communicate as an arts writer then enter the mainstream through pop culture, through television. So suddenly that idea of AI becomes better understood. There are so many artists working in augmented reality who have told me what a difference Pokemon made, because finally, as everybody was talking about this phenomenon, they didn't have to explain anymore what augmented reality was, how to use their pieces. So suddenly pop culture becomes this entry point.
I mean, you must have seen so many shifts like that over the last 20 years. I mean, you could probably go on and on. But, Clement, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and actually, Nora and I were talking about this the other day, and I'm not sure it's the right metaphor, and I'm not a legal expert by any means, but I'm just using it as a metaphor. But to me, it's like the distinction between copyright culture and patent culture, where like copyright culture on one hand just focuses on the single instantiation of a particular idea, and patent culture focuses on the way the idea comes into being, right? And I think, at least in our legal framework, copyright applies to all of our arts, and patents applies to all of our software and most of our technical systems. And I'm not pro-patent or pro-copyright or any of that. I'm just using it as two ways that we kind of approach, that we could approach imaging, like image making, for example. And I think in arts writing, we tend to find a lot more of a copyright approach. And I think it's really interesting when writers, I mean, an article that pops to mind is sort of like Claire Lehman's take on photography recently in Triple Canopy, Color Goes Electric, I think it was called. I'm not remembering the title, but that really took a look at, okay, how does photography work behind the scenes? It was more like a patent approach, and really revealed a lot about the biases implicit in photography, the way we read images, cultural biases, racial biases. Godard famously claiming that Kodak film is racist, for example. And I think all of those things are addressed in technical publications, but not addressed in sort of arts writing as much as they could be. So that would be like a positive, is that hopefully we're seeing more and more of that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Should we take questions from the audience? How are we for time? All right, great. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. This was really great. I have a sort of a naive question. How do you disseminate your work? Are there each piece is an original, right? I mean, are there multiples of, let's say for Ian's work, do you have editions of each one? Is it just one piece? How does that?
Yeah, each work that I've shown you, for example, has several versions. And each version is seeded with slightly different parameters, maybe even slightly different objects or characters in them, which has a kind of changes the entire chemistry of the ecosystem, sometimes in slight ways and sometimes in ways that are really magnified over time. And it's hard for me to know, but yeah, it's kind of like being a chef and you're prepping the same like tomato soup every night, but they're all kind of a little bit different. Some are radically different.
Okay. How many, for instance, of how many
like
different
7, because my gallerist told me so.
Okay.
It's like 7. Because people aren't ready for the scarcity of 3.
Okay.
But 10 is just like, I might as well be on the iTunes store. According to my gallerist.
Okay. I have a question. In the show that you had, that the objects from Clooney were wrapped. What was the actual physicality of that show? That wasn't very clear to me.
So those were CNC foam, so basically 3D reproductions of the objects in foam wrapped in linen inkjet prints with the objects' images on the prints. So I don't know what I was going for, whether or not it was successful, but was these sort of big, heavy stone, weighty, important objects just kind of floating there on these sort of draped linen surfaces, just kind of hovering in the gallery.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So it seems like a sort of common point of friction for all 4 of you was one of perspective. Like Ian and Clement, you have this sort of moving between like photography and cinematic, and Ian, it's hard to even describe the sort of perspective that your simulations have. And then the writers were talking about like this sort of volleying between the aesthetic and the technical in talking about digital work. So I guess my question is if there are perspectives that writers, like alternate perspectives that writers can take. I'm thinking about like what a sort of like Ian Chang perspective in writing would be that goes beyond the like going between the technical and the aesthetic. Does that make sense? Like, are there really exciting writers working now on digital works? Like, what kind of like methods have you found for writing that go beyond those two?
Well, I think it actually depends on how much leeway a publication would give you. You know, if it's a more traditional art magazine, I think they're also looking for more of a standard review. If I would emulate the Ian Cheng perspective on something, it would be about modeling behaviors, of looking at art, and it would be very experimental writing, which I think not every publication is ready for. One of the issues I showed was actually by Freeze, and it was devoted to fiction. So we were all the contributors were being asked to write or imagine fictions of the future. And I really liked that. I don't know how successful it was, but that was more experimental writing of modeling perspectives. Yeah. And I also wanted to add, coming back to perspectives, I think for me it's important to strike a balance between the characteristics and features of the technology that an artist is working with, the history of that technology, as Clement has pointed out, the art historical references for that and the art historical references across media. So it becomes really a multi-perspectival writing process.
Also, just to add to that, on the other end of experimental or playful writing that sort of shapes or reflects the work, I find a lot of my work in reviews is just simplifying and paring down really complex technical ideas and terms, which the word algorithm or the word emergence or the word software, that changes from week to week, month to month, year to year. What it means today doesn't reflect what it meant a year ago. And so there's a huge educational or sort of like primer aspect to a review, like giving a glossary of terms, or before you even start the review, say what you mean by algorithm or say what the artist means by algorithm or coded like a software painting or using or painting with code. It means something completely different for each artist. And so really sitting with their practice, seeing them make the work. Sometimes I'll go on a studio visit and ask the artist to just show me how they made certain parts or like walk me through the code, and I'll hassle them until I understand it. And so I think an educational aspect is a huge part of it, creating language that is really simple enough and accessible enough and does honor to the actual concept, because a lot of these terms become circulated very rapidly without any need to step back and really give the technical definition.
I mean, in the end, I think what you're saying about going to the artist and watching them code or watching them work is important. It's just as important as going to a painter's studio and thinking about how they mix colors. It's always you're sort of making this binary of the technical and the aesthetic, but I think it's a sort of feedback loop from one to the other. So it's important to sort of see how they're related at all times. Another question?
Hello. Maybe it's a related question, but I was more interested in also hearing from Christiane. So when you look at the history of painting, you see movements more or less based on visual styles, and they can be categorized in years. I'm curious to know, in your opinion, what are the most sensible terms or criteria to subcategorize digital art, and if those, let's say, movements can be closed, or can artists always add to these times?
That's actually, it's a very good but also incredibly difficult question, because I think as opposed to other media, digital art is so complex and has so many different forms of expression that vocabulary and taxonomy have been really challenging. So for painting, we may have a certain kind of language, not that it isn't always evolving, but I think it's harder to find that language that creates kind of an umbrella for digital art. Because even between Clement and Ian, and their work is related on some level, there are huge, huge differences. It's a very different register and vocabulary that would apply to both of them. You know? The modeling of behaviors versus the modeling of representation. You know? You can boil it down to certain terms that will surface in works, how generative they are, you know, so how computability works within them, how real-time, the idea of real-time works within them, and then also a vocabulary that is more standard to traditional art in terms of the expression that the work finds. But it's almost, I mean, even thinking about it, I'm struggling with finding categories for that vocabulary, and I think you have to build it for certain classes of work.
You should read her book, Digital Art. I'm actually reading, I read the first edition like 8 years ago, and I'm reading the third edition. So I think it really does lay out different ways of categorizing things in a way that's really useful. So, yeah.
Question for Ian. Are you familiar with Alfred Barr's chart of modern art, and have you published this chart yet online?
No, I don't know that chart. Eager to see it. And I think I Instagrammed it once when I was just like in the thrill of making it, but I'm very interested in using this as a kind of map in which you could, for example, take an interactive fiction journey through it. I don't know, maybe I'll make a comic book of it.
Then there was a question in the front.
I just wondered, two questions, one quick. First one was, are there any interesting female artists working with some of these questions around the generative or the algorithmic or emergence or whatever you want to call it? And another question I had was, or not a question, but just maybe more of an observation, is to do with the kind of, like the different ways that you make the work. So like with Ian's work, it's customized, it's something which you've made yourself, whereas I think, Clement, you're working with more kind of off-the-peg, available consumer level apps, and I think that's another interesting kind of distinction when looking at the digital, because those are two quite different things.
Well, first of all, addressing the gender bias here, which is, we try to mix it, and we've written about Ian's and Clement's work. There are, of course, as many female as male artists working in this field, and some of them pioneers. So Ian's work also reminds me most of what Rebecca Allen did a long, long time ago. She had a project that not many people are familiar with because it couldn't reach an audience at that time, not an audience as broad, called Emergence. And you were basically wandering through a landscape where you would encounter abstract digital creatures. And it was all built on behaviors. So you had to be quiet and watch until some of those creatures would come out. You would scare them if you moved too fast through the environment. So Emergence was really one of the predecessors of the work we're seeing today. But there are numerous female artists who are also working in that area.
You're actually sitting next to one of my favorite artists to your right, Morrishan Al-Yari, who works with 3D printing and is reprinting the artifacts that ISIS destroyed. And so she has a show up now, so you can go and see that.
Yeah, and I would just add, like, a lot of the work that I'm looking at now might be more in the photo world, but I think there's really interesting artists exploring photo representation that way, whether it's Eileen Quinlan or Liz Deschênes. And so those, Maria Robertson, who works with photographic paper directly, so, but that's not digital or tech or new art on the graph. Yeah.
One more question.
You looked back here. Thank you for looking back here. I appreciate it. I first want to say that I really agree with Nora about poetic and experimental forms of writing. I'm really for that. My question is from Clement's talk. I really like the historicals. Anyone can answer it, but it's drawing on the Kera Poeta that you referred to. So they were like, so that's going back like, these are like images from the Byzantine period that were made without a hand, so Cairo being hand, like chirology. And so these are sort of divine images that the human didn't make, but, you know, God made or someone else made. And then you talked about like the Shroud of Turin. And I'm thinking a lot about sort of technocracy, institutionalism, and sort of, I guess, the socio-political scope of technology and being cultural workers in technology. So I'm really interested in what you think about, you know, at what point, what is the resonance between, I guess you can go to things like contemporary New Age kind of takes on kind of techno-mysticism or something where, you know, you have this sort of personal, intuitional connection with technology, how technology is kind of an ubiquitous phenomenon in our world, and how that might have been then. I know it's like, this is just an example of non-human making, and yet for them it was, you know, if it's not human, what is it? And what does that say about technological creation and technological culture at large?
Yeah, I mean, you know, those images are complicated because they're obviously made by humans. There's no real, well, there probably is doubt in some people's minds, but to some degree, okay, there's no doubt in my mind. Like, those images are made by humans, and yet in order for them to function, I think what Christiane was trying to point out, in order for them to function in their role as representation, we have to buy into the belief that they're not made by human or they're somehow transcendental, and call it doublethink or call it an ambiguous relationship. I think it's that relationship to belief and meaning that becomes interesting, and so it also has to do with the stories that we're willing to tell ourselves about how certain things operate. I think, I don't know, trying to bring it to technology, I think Silicon Valley tries to tell a particular story or tell a particular metaphor about how technology operates, and others are trying to tell a very different story or different metaphor. And I think it all has to do with the ways in which we're willing to, the degree to which we're willing to accept these stories about the way technology is functioning, and the way then that we're willing to act on those beliefs in the way that we respond to particular images. I mean, that might all be really complicated, and it's complicated arguments have been made about Byzantine icons quite a bit. But to me, the heart is in that deeply sort of ambiguous or doublethink moment of creation and reception, and how that channels back and forth. You know, and to me, I like look at Ian's work, and I'm fascinated by work that Ian can sit and watch, and that he's obviously created, but he also becomes the viewer in the work, and so there's another complicated, maybe deeply ambiguous cycle there, and I think those are really worth pursuing and really interesting. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's what's interesting about that art historical moment.
All right, well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Whitney and the Thoma for organizing this.